Welcome to another edition of Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. Today we have Dr. Pat Valasquez, who's been known for a number of years. He's done a number of shows with him. My name is Jamal Binding. I'm the chair of the board of Movement Omaha for Race Equity. And we are bringing a number of issues that we're going to talk about today that is pertinent to the climate of our community, our country, and society in general. And we will have about three different areas we're going to talk about: immigration, the racism policy towards Africa, Mexico, Central America, and some issues related to Cuba and so on. So we're going to have a hodgepodge of topics that we're going to discuss in more of a discussion and a response, and hopefully shed some light or throw out some heavy light to help the participants and viewers to get more involved in these issues. So anyway, Pat, do you want to say anything about yourself?
Sure. I was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska, and lived there for over 30 years. And then I've been living in San Diego, California for the last 30 plus years. So I was a social work major at the University of Nebraska campus in Omaha, and then earned a master's in education there. And then when I moved to California, I enrolled in a doctoral program and completed a PhD in higher education. So I consider myself a higher education scholar, a Chicano educator. My grandparents were immigrants from Mexico in the early 1900s, one of the first Mexican families to settle in South Omaha. So right now I'm a retired educator as well, and still active with trying to be an advocate for the empowerment of our local Chicano community, and especially in the area of higher education.
Good, good. And just backdrop for me, I was born in Hayes but raised in Omaha. And so family of 14 kids. And again, just been working on a number of issues. I met Patrick in a graduate class way back in the day. I have a bachelor's in social sciences, political science, history, master's in urban education at UNO, and then an administration from UNO and a certificate in gerontology. But oftentimes, my main claim to fame is I don't have a religious bone in my body. Have a family of 14 kids I came from, and I grew up poor. So it's a little bit about me. So, Patrick, I want to talk about first, like Americans tend to need to be made aware of Cuba, and again, helping the liberation countries. Cuba's real known for helping liberations in Southern Africa. Some people don't know that they helped in Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, and also in South Africa, and how they have helped many African countries and have a great reputation across the globe with many developing countries. We do not have good information what's happening in Cuba today because of the racism and the power of the capitalist elites in Washington, D.C. And sometimes viewers can find excellent films out there that talks about the documentary of the history of Cuba, and particularly its positive roles in contributing to international liberation. And my question I want to throw out, let's to start with, is why is Cuba an example so important for people of color, particularly in the United States, from your perspective?
First of all, I think it is a very important example for all people of color in the United States, at least those of us that want to see the empowerment and the self determination and emancipation of our communities, because this is the kind of fight that Cuba has been battling for many, many years now, over a century, I would say. And its primary adversary has been the government of the United States. So it just strikes me, Jamal, that we're going to talk about a number of topics today, all of which are highlighted or highlight the importance of history and the importance of having a historical consciousness. And so you can't really understand Cuba or appreciate its importance without having some sense of the historical context of Latin America, and especially the role that the United States has played in trying to take away the freedom of Latin American countries to determine their own destiny. Several months ago, if not a year ago, I think, Ajamal, you and I did a book talk about a book called Bad Mexicans by Kelly Lytle Hernandez. And in that book, she does a really good job of displaying how the Mexican dictator, Porfirio Diaz, in the early 20th century, allowed the United States corporations to come into Mexico and buy and basically rape a huge portion of Mexico's land and its natural resources. And so this has been the modus operandi for the United States as long as this country's been in existence. It's looked at Latin America as a backyard to be exploited. And many, many times, more times than we can probably count, the United States has upheld, propped up very violent, oppressive dictators in various Latin American countries. only because, again, like Diaz in Mexico, those dictators allow the United States to come in and rape the country of its resources. So this is what happened in Cuba and what was happening under the dictatorship of Fulgencio Bautista until Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and a number of other Cuban revolutionaries overthrew the Bautista regime. And since that time in 1959, I would say that the Cuban government has tried to construct a society in opposition to the United States. So, whereas the United States has basically a corrupt, unchecked capitalism as its economic system, Cuba has tried to implement a socialist economic system. Now, there are elements of capitalism in Cuba, just like there are elements of socialism in the United States. Neither country has a pure economic system, but um, the country of Cuba and its people have fought so strenuously against United States oppression for um, at least it's been, I believe, about 65 years
Exactly.
since the Cuban Revolution. And so, another important thing to remember, Cuba is a non-white country. The majority of people in Cuba are black or they have African roots. And so the kind of oppression that the United States has perpetrated against Cuba, the United States would never do that to a white European country. And so the example that the United States has of imperializing Cuba goes back over a century. And it's something that I think is a real lesson for those of us who are people of color in the United States to learn from. I have to say, Ajamal, that right now in 2024, I'm really struck by the empathy and the concern that so many blacks and Chicanos and other people of color have in our country for the people of Palestine, for the Palestinian people, because of the genocide to which they're being subjected by the Israeli government. And of course, the Israeli government is doing it with the direct support and complicity of the United States government. And so, I've been struck by how many Chicanos and African Americans are putting themselves on the line, getting arrested and beaten by cops because of their demonstrations against this Israeli and United States genocide of the Palestinian people. I think we should be equally concerned and empathetic about Cuba because even though the United States is not bombing Cuba, what they're doing to Cuba with their economic embargo is equally cruel. And it's trying to do much the same thing to disempower the Cuban people, to change the government and create another form of government and another form of economic system that the United States favors. And again, we should be concerned and do everything within our power to make sure this does not happen.
You know, as you mentioned that, I remember years ago, there was a group of Cubanos or Cubans who came to Omaha, and there was a group who lived here, and they were very belligerent. They didn't want them to speak. It was almost like they were rabid or they were crazy. And again, the guy who came from Cuba was just talking about the current conditions and trying to find information. They kept interrupting. It was almost like we couldn't even hear the speech, even though we had a decent moderator that day. I had a couple of questions, and I almost couldn't even get them in because people were just so the Cubans who were refugees from back when Castro chased their elite sellout butts out of the country. They were just extremely angry and bitter. And again, I'm not going to say that there were some cases where people had some problems, but at the end of the day, when you saw the exploitation in Cuba, it was something we had to deal with. I'm going to move over and ask you, why are white people or whites and white Marine folks sojourning against the immigration of blacks and brown folks, but they allow their particular relatives or the Ukrainian and some people who they like, and even some of the Cubans they let come in here? What is behind this fear, this duality of how we treat immigrants who come here? And I'm switching up from Cuba, but it's all related.
Yeah, it is related. In fact, the Cubans are one group that is seeing a lot of immigration from their country to the United States. And a lot of people are just so desperate because of the tough economic conditions there that they're coming to the United States, knowing full well that there's a very racist society in the U.S. So I think the answer to your question, though, is relatively simple. Excuse me, that the fear among white folks in the United States about the current U.S. Southern, so-called Southern border crisis is a fear about demographic changes in the United States.
Wait, explain that a little bit more. Can you use the word demographic fear? That's a new concept. What does that mean here, Patrick, in your work?
Essentially, that the racial complexion of the country is changing. So,
Oh,
so
okay.
I remember when I started teaching at the University of California in San Diego, I taught a course in the summer about racial issues, racism, and I used to tell the students that in the United States at that time, this was like 1989, that about three-fourths of the United States population was white. By the time I retired in 2017, I had to change that to say that about two-thirds of the US population was white. And you've got states like where I live in California where Latinos actually outnumber whites. Whites are no longer the biggest ethnic group in the state of California. And there are other states that will follow that in the reasonably near future. So white folks are afraid of losing their majority, and that's just the means of an end because what they're really concerned about is the possible dismantling of the racial hierarchy in the United States. So as long as there has been a United States of America, there has been an entrenched system of what people call systemic or structural racism. There's a racial hierarchy that positions white folks at the top in terms of dominant power in every aspect of society, and people of color at the lower rungs of the ladder. And so I think what we're seeing is sort of an unspoken fear among whites that this racial hierarchy could be dismantled and they will lose the unearned white privilege that they've always had in this country. So if you look, and racial hierarchy is not the only structural hierarchy in our society. We're also structured by wealth or income. And so many people would argue we're also structured by gender. But if you look at, for example, the MAGA movement, which is the clearest manifestation of this fear, this demographic fear that whites have, the majority, I would argue, the majority of white folks in the MAGA movement, if not damn near all of them, they're not concerned or thinking that Trump is going to elevate the status of working class people. That's not even on their mind. What they're concerned about is that Trump will protect their white privilege. And despite all his other faults, the fact that he's a convicted felon, that he has a track record of never caring about anybody but himself, they are willing to support him as far as you can take it, man. They will support him because he is promised, in no uncertain terms and very clearly, to uphold the racial hierarchy, to maintain the racial hierarchy and the white privilege that goes along with it.
Wow, you know what's fascinating is you were saying that, and a follow up kind of like everything is South Africa's wrestling with the same thing. They got rid of apartheid, but at the end of the day, there was no transference of the land or the wealth, in spite of what the whites did to the Africans many years ago, 1913 to the Land Act. And then you just alluded to California, where you're in the majority, and still you still can't get a transference of all the benefits of white privilege got all those white folks who were racist and part of the Trumpites. So again, it's a kind of a very I want to say a strange kind of a paradox that we got to deal with because, again, at some point we'll vote certain rights, but as long as they have their wealth and they have all their income, like the whites in South Africa, blacks are still in bad positions. California in the majority, but you still don't have the political power that's commensurable with your population numbers as whites have had in our apartheid systems. So let me ask you a different. We'll come to another point, and I'm come back to. We talked about Cuba, but Senator Mendez and the binding policy towards Cuba, and one of the things what we noticed in the news lately is that here Senator Mendez he's a Cuban American from New Jersey, and we know that New Jersey is probably one of the most corrupt state in the United States, along with Louisiana. Just constant corruption, things over the years, and so on. And my question is he's got caught for some bribery, conspiracy, corruption charges, and as I said earlier, he's also a Latino. Okay, and what are some of your reactions, or those of us of color, when we see a prominent U.S. senator being dragged into court over some stuff that he did as an elected official? And how do we avoid getting involved in those similar incidents? So, do we have a lot of skin in that game, or are you just one of those guys we look at and say, "Hey, that's part of where he's at"? I'm a little confused about how we have to deal with leadership who look like us or who are a person of color, but yet they get caught with their hands in the cookie jar.
Yeah, we're talking, of course, about Robert Menendez, the Cuban American, as you said, the United States Senator. He's a United States Senator, and until recently, until he was charged with corruption, he was the chair of one of the most powerful committees in the United States Senate. And he's been in the Senate for a long time. This is actually his second trial, his second federal trial on corruption charges. The first one resulted in a hung jury that couldn't convict him. And one thing I would say about Menendez is that to me, he's not a Latino. He's what we say in Spanish, a gusano. He's a worm. And that's a term for slime balls like Menendez that left Cuba. His family left Cuba. They were the people that were propping up the cruel dictatorship. Talk about corruption, the dictatorship of Bautista in Cuba before the Cuban Revolution. And so there's an incredible degree, it seems to me, just from what I've heard, an incredible degree of evidence against him. So he's being charged with taking bribes from business people in New Jersey in order to look the other way on certain issues or to make sure that they get privileges in federal contracts that are awarded out. And so they've raided his home and found literally hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash in
And
his home.
gold and stuff like that. He blamed
Yes,
it on his
gold
wife.
bars and it's tucked into the pockets of his suits. And so, and one of the shames about it is that he was using all this money and these bribes to do things like buy a new car for this white woman that he ultimately married. And so it's a really sickening situation in every sense of the word. And I can only hope that the evidence is enough to convict him. Again, he's going to be tried, I suppose, in New Jersey, and it's probably going to be hard once again to find a jury that will convict him. But hopefully, his career as a politician is over. We'll talk more about his influence over U.S. policy in Cuba, but I'm hoping that that this will be the end of his career. In terms of what you said, like how do we perceive this as people of color? Man, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that one of our biggest tasks as activists is to hold our own community folks accountable. So whenever we see African Americans or Chicanos, Latinos, Native people in positions of power, we have to hold them accountable just like we would anybody else. Way too many times I have seen people of color turn the other way and say, we don't want to call them out because they're one of us. And gee, there's so few of us in positions of power. And that person had to work so hard to get there. We don't want to destroy their career, but we have to do what's necessary in order to think about the community first and the individual second. No individual is more important than the community collectively.
It's kind of like that Star Trek. Does the one rights outweigh of the many? And so I see that in City Hall. We got handkerchief heads and Negroes and sellouts down there who won't bust a grape and don't have any piece of paper or public pronouncement or anything where they've advocated for the Black community. And you hear them talk about I all the time, and it's kind of sad. I know we've also talked a little bit. We've talked about the President Biden, and I like to say Biden like my name. What is your policies towards Democrats and, of course, towards the immigration, Cuba, and so on? What do you think about this election coming up in November? Where are you at? Because I've heard a lot of us say they want to sit it out. Some of us say we'll vote for the lesser of two evils. You got two different rats running. One person got this fault, the other one got that one, and so you vote for the lesser of two evils. So what are some of our observations on this election? Because it's going to be a very tight one looking at, it should not be looking at the corruption and who maggot, is it maggots or maggot? Anyway, what's going on out there? How do we feel on that?
Yeah, man, it's really sad. You and I are about the same age, and the first presidential election that I voted in was 1972 when George McGovern ran against Richard Nixon. That was a clear choice. And of course, unfortunately, Nixon won by a landslide, which tells you everything you need to know about the direction the country was pointed in at that time. But since then, it seems like every presidential election has been like this one, having to go in there and choose between the lesser of two evils and just grit your teeth and vote for the least slimiest of the two slime balls.
Oh, hold your
So
nose, as Ernie says, one rat over another rat. I got to pick
yeah,
the greatest rat
basically
of the rats.
right. Which rat is preferable? And so um, in California, California is it's a pretty much a done deal. It's obvious California is a quote unquote blue state. They're going to vote overwhelmingly for Biden. And when I go into the voting booth, I might find it too sickening to vote for either one, and I might end up voting for someone like Cornel West. Honestly, it's not going to make any difference. My vote won't make a difference because, again, California will go overwhelmingly for Biden. If I was in a swing state like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, I might have to weigh things differently. But yeah, in terms of Biden, and I know we're concerned about his policy toward immigration, his policy toward Cuba. As we know, he's done a couple of things to change immigration policy just within the last month or so. And it seems like, as they say in football, a Hail Mary, like a last ditch effort because he's polling so poorly when it comes to immigration. This takes us back to your previous question about the fear that whites have about the increasing numbers of people of color storming across the border and trying to steal their white privilege. And so Biden knows that, and he's trying to show that he can be just like Trump and make it tougher for people to get asylum in the United States. And then he tried to initiate some kind of executive order that would allow the spouses of undocumented folks to apply for legal residency. Ultimately, both of these executive orders that he signed might be overturned in the courts. I know the ACLU has challenged his new policy on asylum. So it might not, again, it might be just all for show and for symbolism.
Patrick, quickly, I want to say is that when I was in the Peace Corps and I married my wife from Botswana, and we were expecting a baby at some point, and basically she came to the country as an undocumented, well, she came as a permanent resident, and she got it really quickly after I wrote a letter to the Secretary of Vance or whoever was the Secretary of State. And within 6 months, they gave her the green card. It was real quick. It was almost like given. And she held on becoming an American citizen for 25 years. She didn't know if she wanted to renounce her citizenship in Botswana. But my point is, it was a lot easier because we were married and had a child. And I'm surprised it's become more tougher for people. So if you marry someone, I would assume that they would automatically almost get a chance to be a permanent resident or almost a citizen by virtue of marriage, and particularly if you got kids. So I don't understand why this country is so harsh on that, but yet they let all these other Ukrainians or Jewish people come in overnight in special visas because they have money or whatever. And again, it's not fair. And I think at one point, you and I talked about the number of people who've been standing in line, relatives for years, 10, 20 years to get in, and they always make all these exceptions for other people. But I'm a little surprised that we're making it hard for the spouses. Again, I understand if somebody's doing a sham act, that makes sense. But when people are duly married and they got kids and they've been around for years, I don't know why you want to deport them or treat them like they're a bunch of crazy people, which is not fair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not an immigration attorney, and so I can't get into the details of the policies, but I mean, this is just part of an ongoing wave over the last decades about trying to make immigration more restrictive.
And it's crazy throughout. One of the things you and I have talked over the months or whatever, and we both know we read the book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This is probably like a Bible for those of us in education liberation. And I want to kind of allude to Paul Fair. He has another book, Pedagogy of Hope, which I'm looking at. I've had it for years, but I'm starting to read it because I find his book almost like a Bible in education. I know it's not required reading in many of these functionary education departments, and particularly in the Department of Education, UNO, and elsewhere. But my question is the concept of resistance. Paul referred right about that in his book and through his theme and so on. And one of the major pieces in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which helps us to develop strategies to challenge oppressive education, challenge education, and help provides liberatory education to help oppress people, students, and so on, change the circumstances. And so my question kind of to you is, why is Paul Freire so important and crucial for our educational transformation as people who believe in liberation education?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. Paulo Freire's work has had a lot of influence on me. And I have to admit, when you and I were in the same master's program in urban education, and one of the courses I took in that program, we had to read Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. And the book pretty much went over my head at that point because I didn't have any experience as an educator. But over 10 years later, in my doctoral program, I reread the book, and this time it made all the sense in the world. And there was so much good material in that book. The importance, I think, is there's several dimensions of importance, but one of them is, again, people like you and I believe in this, in the power of education, that if you have an oppressed community, there's almost no way that that community can lift itself out of oppression without education. But it has to be a certain type of education, an empowering education. And that's really what Freire put into words and what he put into operation. And what's great, one of the things I loved about Freire is that he was not just a theoretician. He didn't just come up with theory, although he did theory, but he was a practitioner. He was a
Right.
teacher. He
Praxis.
practiced the very theories of education that he posited. So I think that was really admirable and extremely helpful. One of the things that he wrote about that I really internalized, and I still believe, and I see examples of this all the time, is his saying that only the oppressed can free themselves, that the oppressor can never empower or
Wow.
free the oppressed. And only the strength that comes from the oppressed is sufficient to overthrow oppression. And, you know, I see, I'm sure you have too, I've seen throughout my life as an adult and as an activist, a lot of well intentioned white folks and some that aren't very well intentioned, but people who want to come into the Chicano community or the Black community and do all these great things for us and
Great white saviors, we call them.
yeah, establish schools and like there's examples of what are called charter schools in California. I think actually it's a nationwide phenomenon, but white folks who set up charter schools in the Black community or Chicano community, and it turns out to be a very colonial education, a very colonial sense of what, you know, basically what white people see as the kind of education that people of color need, and there's no empowering dimension to it. The term that Freire used was false generosity. That when you see white folks doing these acts of benevolence for people of color, it's what he called false generosity. And essentially, what he was saying is that white people do it because it makes them feel good. And if people of color were truly empowered and they didn't need help from anybody else, then white folks would lose that mechanism to feel good, right? And so they continue to actually support the oppression and the disempowerment of people of color, even as they appear to be trying to sort of lend a helping hand or give us an education that will help us to survive in the white world. And I've seen some really terrible examples of this. One at the university where I worked, where they established a scholarship program for students of color, and they would bring them into these dinners and literally tell them like how to pick up a fork with a fork, where to put your napkin on the table.
Oh,
When
wow.
you go out to a bourgeois dinner, like how to conduct your. It was just terrible.
So you experienced that in university then?
Yes, at the University of California, San Diego did that.
So you would think by the age of we're like 18 or whatever you were in college, you would know how to eat. And again, it's like the same thing I see with Omaha Housing Authority, plantation housing, where they'd say, "Oh, we're going to teach you how to clean." Okay, I mean, there's some things that I've seen over the years. That same thing you talk about, and even when we do food pantries, we'll teach you how to make this meal and how to prepare your meager budget and do this when poor people have been doing that stuff all their lives. But yeah, there's that arrogance and
Mhm.
stupidity and ignorance and asinine behavior that some people and many don't get.
And so Freire's critique was excellent. He also, and I used to teach this to the students at the university I work with, that he also was very good at pointing out specifically what happens to people in our thinking when we've been colonized or oppressed for long periods of time, and how entire communities or ethnic groups of folks can lose their sense of who they are, they can lose their confidence, they can want to be like the oppressor they can want to adopt all the models of the oppressor, and they become, as he said, fearful of their own freedom. They
Wow.
become afraid of their own freedom. So he had this incredible critique of oppression, but he also had very specific strategies of how to implement an empowering education. That was equally important and valuable.
Patrick, one of the things I know that you and I both worked in higher education in different communities. You in California, I in Nebraska. Nebraska is considered apartheid state more so, and fewer people of color than California. But knowing your experience and growing up here in Omaha and so on, if you had to reform education and again teacher education, both secondary and post-secondary, how would you best structure in terms of literature looking at people of color? And then who are some Chicano scholars who write about resistance against racism, other form of oppression? Because again, we talk of Paulo Freire, but my question is, what are some other things we can deal with?
Well, I think some of the things that Freire pointed out could be adapted. Again, he was pointing out more so like the situation. He was from Brazil in South
Okay,
America, and as a Brasileño, um, the concerns of racism there, but also economic oppression or classism. But I think the Freire agenda and the pedagogy could be adopted, and I've used some of that. I've implemented it with university students who are just out of high school, and essentially, it puts the teacher in the role of facilitator. It empowers the students to express their own voice. So I think that is part of the transformational change that we need in education today. I think also we have to understand that as Chicanos, African Americans, Native people, that it's important for us in order to be emancipated and empowered that we have to know our history, we have to know our culture, we have to be able to analyze the existing structures of our society and be able to tell exactly where the changes are that need to be made. And all of this should be part of the school experience from K through post secondary. And, I think one of the arguments against that is that, well, young students, like in middle school or high school, they're too young to understand all those complexities. And I would totally reject that because that has not been the experience that I've had with
so
young
in other
people.
words, you're saying that we should teach it at a younger age, and we sometimes wait too late to teach our kids or our families about these concepts or these theories.
Yes, I mean, we start teaching English at a very young age, and yet we still have English classes all the way through graduate school. So I think the same thing is true of things like ethnic studies, black studies, Chicano studies. They should start no later than elementary school and go all the way through graduate school.
Got you, got you. One of the things you were alluding to, I kind of alluded to some of the great Chicano scholars, and one of the books that had a great influence on me because we oftentimes look at Central and South America and think, okay, how do those countries become so bad and people want to immigrate here? And when I read the book Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Gorilla, I'm not sure if I pronounce his name, it was like the book is about 5th century pillage of the continent, and he documented so well how those countries became so bad and negative because of American influence. You alluded to earlier, Patrick, Bad Mexicans, and I had a chance to read that book and found it fascinating about the struggle of Latinos and Chicanos in this country for liberation against Mexican officials in the country, but also the collaboration of our military type people who were in this country who were really in with the elites. And so when you start looking at these books, you almost have to read them and understand that this is like the essence of understanding how things got to be, and it didn't happen overnight. Because a lot of the young whippersnappers, they think things just happened this way last night, just like the Black Lives Matter movement. There's stuff that happened a long time ago, and if you read these books, you gotta, wow, they've been playing a game on us for generations and centuries. And of course, the Catholic Church, they were involved in enslavement, and again, only Georgetown has been talking about it, but Creighton is not going to bust a grape on it. We're working on them, but we got to talk about all these histories of our people and how we got to be where we are because it didn't happen overnight.
Yes, and you asked about other scholars. There have been several. I think the scholar that's getting a lot of attention and justifiably so right now is Dr. Gina Garcia, who teaches at UC Berkeley. And she has a roadmap, a guide for how to transform higher education to make it more equitable and empowering for the kinds of students that are increasingly entering colleges and universities. And these are students of color. There have been people like Laura Rendon, who's written a lot about um, the importance of validating, having college campuses validate students of color in multiple ways. Silvia Hurtado at UCLA has done a lot to point out how something called campus racial climate affects our adjustment in higher education. And one of my favorites, Ajamal, is a guy from UCLA named Daniel Solorzano. And he's written about the importance of people of color as transformational teachers and transformational mentors. And what he says, he talks about resistance, and resistance to oppression is important, but there's sort of there can be a sort of dysfunctional resistance when people see that oppression's happening and they don't accept it, but what they do in response doesn't really do much to help their situation. So I know you and I, Ajamal, were both familiar with the work of John Ogbu and
Oh, yeah, he was at graduate school. We studied him.
yeah, how he wrote about oppositional consciousness, and that a lot of students of color, they can tell that the game is rigged, that schools are racist, but their response is to just not go to school or to drop out, to talk back to teachers, to not do their homework. And in the end, it doesn't do a lot to help them. So what Solorzano argued was that what we need is transformational resistance, which includes having a commitment to social justice that comes from the heart, a very heartfelt commitment to social justice, but also a critique of oppression that comes from the mind. So we have to feel that commitment to social justice, but we also have to have the critical thinking that enables it to critique oppression and develop strategies to combat it.
You know, you mentioned Abdul. He wrote a book called Minority Education and Caste, and he basically said African Americans and people of color live in a caste-like educational system because they've been here for generations, and the education hasn't got them out of the caste system, which was kind of profound at that time because it compared our experience like India. And so again, you can almost predict that we're going to be stuck in this quagmire, this kind of straitjacket, in spite of all the stuff we do, because white folks have had such a head start and they control the apparatus of the system, education, and people found it very thought-provoking, profound when he came out. A lot of the traditional functionaries and white supremacists and MAGA type people didn't accept his book, but he subsequently passed to the spirit world. He's now an ancestor, now following him over years, that he helped me to understand why people, in spite of all their problems in the South, the Southwest, you name it, the system still was rigged against them. You can have more education in your counterpart who has to be white, and you still wouldn't get promoted in these apartheid racist systems like UNO or Metro or other places like that. I'm going to switch up if I can, and you and I have not talked a lot about this over the years, or months rather. You were the director of the Latino Center of the Midlands. It was called Chicano Awareness Center back there when you and I met and so on. That was over 35 years ago. And you dealt with some advocacy issues. You took some positions that you pushed back at some of the white supremacists. I'm thinking about the guys at United Way and some of those funding sources. And you also had a relationship that was pretty good with your board of directors and so on. And one of the questions I'm asking you is, what were some of those pushbacks for you as a Latino or Chicano who was pushing against that hierarchical racism, white supremacy system in Omaha, Nebraska, which still exists today?
Well, you mentioned one, the United Way of the Midlands, so the Chicano Awareness Center. At that time, this is the early 1980s, we were a United Way agency, and I presume the Latino Center of the Midlands still is, but
Right, they are.
we had to adhere to the regulations of United Way. The dynamic that happened is that, like, one of our biggest advocacy struggles was the Omaha Public Schools, which you know better than I do that they still remain an extremely racist institution. And when we called out the school district for its racist policies and practices, the superintendent of public schools would call the director of United Way or important people on their board and say, "Hey, why is one of your United Way agency directors criticizing my district? You know, don't you know that we have thousands of employees and most of them donate to United Way? And I don't understand why we're being criticized." And so then the thumb would come down on me. And I had to tell United Way several times, look, man, that we turn in our statistics every year with all the people that we're serving, and the reason why we serve people is because they believe in us, they trust us, And if we didn't do this kind of collective advocacy in addition to direct services, we wouldn't have that credibility and we wouldn't be able to exist. So I was able to usually make them back off. The other adversary that we had, unfortunately, came from our own community. And so there were organizations of older, what I would call Hispanic folks, like the American GI Forum, a pro military, pro imperialism sort of organization of Hispanic veterans, about as brainwashed and colonized as you could imagine. And so they tried to undercut what we did at the Chicano Awareness Center and undercut the advocacy that we conducted on multiple fronts. So it was quite a struggle,
By
man.
the way, was La Raza back then? Because I heard of them recently, and I heard of that group, and I know we got some kind of group here that doesn't have a lot of teeth. They're trying to do something, but was they back there with the GI Forum? Because I didn't hear of them back then.
No, I don't remember that. There was another group called LULAC, which was almost as conservative as the GI Forum. And
Wow. Switching up, many in our community are misguided because the new generation failed to understand our ancestors' teachings and the advocates from the 1900s to the 1960s, so on, the 70s on. And we could drop some name like Dolores Huta, who was a labor leader who was really well famous, to your co-founder at the United Farm Workers with Cesar Chavez. And how many of us today, and scholars in ethnic studies like Black studies or Chicano studies or Latino studies, we fail to understand the importance of combining that scholarship with their activism. And so I wanted you to kind of talk about some of those things back there that had influenced you and me, obviously, by listening to those people.
yeah, just from the from the standpoint of observation and the experience that I've had here in San Diego for over 30 years now, you have institutions like San Diego State, which has one of the oldest departments of Chicana and Chicano studies. There's a community college downtown San Diego, which is called City College. Also has a very well established, hate to use the word old, but well established Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies. And both institutions, San Diego State and City College, have Black Studies departments as well. Um, San Diego State, I think, has done a pretty good job of supporting their departments. And so they tend to continue, I think, honoring the tradition and the legacy of what this kind of diverse curriculum was developed and implemented for in the first place. So they are trying to, I think, maintain a empowering education. But honestly, man, there's always a tension even within some of these departments. The city college and some of the other community colleges probably do it more consistently in terms of something very important, which is enacting the model of scholar activist, so that you can be a scholar but a community activist at the same time. There are some professors that I see in ethnic studies areas that clearly believe that simply talking and teaching and writing and research, that scholarship in itself is a form of activism. One of the stupidest things I ever heard in my 28 years at UC San Diego was an ethnic studies professor who told his students that studying is a revolutionary act. So he was basically saying, yeah, you can take your chemistry textbook and go to one of the beautiful beaches in San Diego and just kick back and read chemistry, and you're just like Che Guevara or Nelson Mandela, man. Like, you're a revolutionary. And man, there's so much more to it than that. When I think of revolution, I think of people putting themselves on the line and oftentimes having to commit violence. That's what revolutionaries do. And so, but there are some folks who believe in this strictly scholarly model for ethnic studies, and they pass that along to their students, which is a real shame. Um, they seem to fail to learn some of the lessons. Again, we talked about Paulo Freire. Freire talked about this principle of praxis, right? Praxis being the union of theory and dialogue and reflection and action. but you have to have action in the formula. Again, it can't be action just going by the seat of your pants or knee jerk reaction, but you have to have the theory and dialogue and reflection and action in order to be effective. And so I do see this tension where some of the younger faculty in these departments, they never went through these civil rights movements. They never went through the black civil rights movement or the Chicano movement or the American Indian movement. They only read about it or they only heard people talk about it. So it's probably more difficult for them to relate and to really be able to see the impact that it had. Because I think for people like you and I watched the Chicano movement develop in a city like Omaha, Nebraska. I was a college student, and I'm sure it was different than it is in places in the Southwest like San Diego or Los Angeles or
Arizona.
Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. But I have a strong sense of the impact that it had on the community, and so I can understand these folks that all they can do is watch videos on YouTube, and it probably doesn't resonate to the same degree.
Related to that, Black Studies is another joke in Omaha. You got people who, I one time asked the Black chair one time, what do you think the graduates or people who've taken a class in Black Studies should be about? And her response was, they should be able to think critically and da 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 da. And at the end of the day, how does that help Black folks? Or you got people who come out with degrees and they don't want to come back to the community, or they get so much with their lips on the breast of those systems that they don't even want to deal with an advisory committee. Or you got people who are teaching the department who haven't set foot in our community in years, and yet supposedly Black scholars are supposed to do the research. And I look at a lot of the Negroes in our community, in our state, who even have PhDs, and I've never seen them write anything scholarly or anything, even editorial. They're afraid of us, some of these handkerchief heads. So at some point, I even call for the abolition of Black studies. If they're not going to do the work to help liberate and work in our community how we created it, what good is having a toothless bulldog who can't sit and bite even a chihuahua or a Shih Tzu, whatever you want to call those little tiny dogs? But it's just crazy. One of the things that we also see in our society, Patrick, where in today's language, there's all these euphemisms and people got terms and acronyms and name it. And lately, I've seen these so-called race experts call themselves DEI specialists or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I just saw recently the clowns put the word justice behind it. Again, abstract. And my question is, what are your observations on these so-called DEI experts who are oftentimes trained and educated on YouTube or Facebook or in their own corporations of doing this work? Heidi, what is a DEI expert from your vantage point?
From what I've observed in California, so some of them are doing good work,
Okay.
others are doing nothing or just trying to maintain the status quo. At the university I was at University of California in San Diego, the DEI, she called herself an assistant vice chancellor, and she saw her job as protecting the racist administration and maintaining the racist status quo. And she would do everything she could to stamp out anybody who tried to critique the racist policies and practices of the institution. On the other hand, I've seen some institutions like San Diego State where the DEI folks have tried to do something substantive. There's this huge tension also that exists in something as important as faculty hiring. This is true at the university level, the level of four-year universities in San Diego, but also community colleges. So some of the DEI folks, they have an uphill battle, man, and they're trying hard to change the way in which faculty are hired so that you don't end up hiring some racist or some Uncle Tom, Tio Taco type that comes in and does a disservice to the very field that they're in. And so, again, it's a mixed bag for me.
So you've seen them both on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, but ultimately, Ajmal, ultimately, they report to the administration. They usually report directly to the president of the university or perhaps one of the assistant presidents or associate presidents. And if that person is really committed, some good things will happen. But if they're not committed to anything other than a racist status quo, then you have nothing positive.
In Omaha, we've traditionally hired some of the handkerchief head Uncle Tom sellout OPS staff members and teachers who have no track record of advocating for our community. In actual fact, they acquiesce to the system. And again, when you're out there all the time and just interacting with some of those neophytes or those people who are white supremacists, you can't have a sense of balance. And I find it very sad when, you see these people, they're more concerned about old school drill team or marching down on Juneteenth, and they have no sense of challenging even things that happen in their own families when it comes to race and so on. In one of our previous programs, you spoke about colonialization and education, which is internal colonialization. You use those terms a couple of times. And, in other words, Black and Chicano scholars in the 1970s used to use those terms. Is that stuff still relevant in 2024, would you say?
Absolutely, it is. I believe so. The term internal colonialism, I think, is still valuable, and it does contribute to our understanding. Now, my impression, focusing on the way it was used in the Chicano community or among scholars in the Chicano community, that had a big impact, and I think it did a really good job of describing at its heart the sort of oppressive situation in which Chicanos live in the United States and what our communities are like. So I saw a number of, I think, very skilled, knowledgeable Chicano scholars that used that term and applied that term. The one critique that I've heard that I think does make some sense is that it tended to neglect the importance of classism in terms of the oppression of communities like Chicanos or African Americans. Again, that we've got, as we said earlier, we've got a racial hierarchy or a system of structural racism in our society, and we've got classism, a structural system that oppresses people of color on the basis of socioeconomic class. And just as we have white privilege in the United States, we have wealthy privilege, or wealth privilege. And so there's not a contradiction there, but both need to be emphasized because they both contribute to the oppression of people of color. And some of the things that these scholars wrote about internal colonialism, like they use the term cultural genocide. And I think that still happens in our community where our culture is either ignored or sublimated, oppressed, especially when you look at curriculum.
Yeah, as you mentioned that, something came to mind. I'm thinking about, I saw something recently about Jay-Z and Beyonce went to one of those Arab countries and they stayed in a hotel that cost $100,000 a night. Okay. And I'm like, what kind of crap is that? Again, it deals with even our own community. People say, is those kind of elite people oppressed or racially or whatever because they have that kind of money? But the fact that they can spend that kind of money when there's some people starving, the same thing with Oprah Winfrey when she went to Switzerland, and the woman refused to sell her purse. And then when she came back and talked about it, all the white people jumped on her because they felt she shouldn't have talked about that. She asked for a certain purse, and that Switzerland woman said, "I don't think you can afford that." She didn't know who Oprah was, obviously. But my point is, even in our own communities, we got some crazy class issues we got to deal with because oftentimes the elite and the bourgeois and the sellout, like the Urban League and the NAACP type people, can care less about our struggle because they're so busy harping on the mentality of being like these kind of movie star types or sports figures and not do anything. We're getting down to our last question. Now, we just wanted to talk to you about your own respective career and so on. You have a PhD, obviously, a scholar. You're an administrator at the University of San Diego. What would you say was your most significant contributions, and can others replicate it in your measurement of what you do? Because oftentimes we get older, we reflect about, was it worth it? I used to say, was it worth me being in the Peace Corps? And I say, yes, after I look at all the stuff they did for me versus what I did for them. So my question is kind of a reflection question on you. What was it? Was it worth it? And or what can you point to that would be your proudest moments?
Yeah, I don't know if there was one moment. I would say it's more the overall track record of resistance, and it's interesting. It's a very conscious choice that we have to make. I think I could have done things differently in my 28 years at UC San Diego. Um, if I wanted to be like some of the other Chicanos that I observed there and just keep my mouth shut and play the game and support the administration, I think I could have gone higher, if you want to put it that way, higher in the career hierarchy. But it wasn't worth it to me, man. And so it was more important for me to try to challenge the inequities and the oppression that I saw. And so I think, one of the best things I did that helped me in that was getting a PhD. and getting knowledge of all the scholarship that says that this is the way it needs to be. That if you want students of color to succeed, the institutions need to look like this. The institutions need to change. And so, if there's anything I feel good about, I think it's my consistency of resistance. And I know we talked about this over the years, and these are conversations that a number of us have. Is like we end up fighting some of the same battles now that we're fighting decades ago, and we certainly haven't won the fight, but there's so much at stake, and the adversaries are very formidable. So we can't always judge what we've done on the basis of the results. To me, the important thing is to resist and to show resistance, to manifest resistance to oppression, and to struggle for social justice. I would like to think that I was, along with all the people I worked with, I don't think I did anything on my own, but with the people I worked with, that we influenced students. When I look at a number of former students that I keep in touch with now, a lot of them are teachers or counselors. A lot of them have PhDs. They're educators. Some are doctors and lawyers. And so I think we were influential in helping them to develop that commitment to social justice that we talked about earlier and the critique of oppression. And so, um, I think if you look at the website of the organization that I'm a part of, the San Diego Chicano Latino Concilio on higher education, we have a number of position papers, letters, reports that we've written. And I think that's a testament to our perseverance and our advocacy. I'm like you, Jamal. I see a number of people that could write. They know how to write. And I'm talking about people of color that know how to write, and they don't write anything, man.
Not even
They
position paper
they won't
editorials.
write an editorial to a newspaper. They won't write a letter to a racist policymaker. They're afraid to write anything, and so I think that's one thing good about the people that I work with is that we're able to put things in writing, and we leave that as a legacy for future generations.
Pat, we're down to the end. I just want to make a couple of comments. Number one, I think we also need to bring Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, Black Skin, White Mass, Towards the African Revolution, some of those books, because he talks about how African countries be liberated. And he uses the word violence. He says, you're never going to find the stuff that the Belgians and the French did to African folks. They're going to just walk away and become nonviolent, even in the case of South Africa. And so, again, Americans talk about American Revolution, but when it comes to people of color, they want us to, we shall overcome and get slipped upside of our head and that. And so I think you read his books and Emil Cabral and some of those liberation books of African folks who have fought, we can see our inspiration, our connectedness as universal people. But I want to really end on one note that I found fascinating. You and I have not really talked about this, but I hadn't seen you for many years, and you and I were, very close. We were like pit bulls in our class dealing with those white supremacist educators at UNO and elsewhere, and particularly the Omaha Plantation School. I sometimes call it the Omaha Pacification School. But you talked to Teresa Barn McCagney, who has her PhD, and she works in the School of Social Work. And you asked her one day, "How's my old comrade Ajamal doing? My compadre? We used to run back and take apart some of these racist situations, including John Flynn and those deans of education." And you said, "I wonder if he's working now for OPS. Has he gone to the other side?" And she says, "No, no, not Ajamal. He's still out there." And Teresa gave me a great compliment years ago. I don't know if she follows her own lesson, but she made a comment that years ago when she left the Chicano Awareness Center, she got a job at UNO being one of their graduate students and elsewhere getting her PhD. She says in summer classes for other people. Aljamal said to me that if I get out here and I change up and I don't do what I'm supposed to do for our communities, meaning Latinos, Native American, Asians, and so on, African Americans, he's going to come at me. And she used to say it with a sense of pride. And I said, you must have heard what my ancestors said to me. We sent you to that institution to come back and help us dismantle some of the crap we got to deal with every day. And so often, Patrick, as we say in those African proverbs, we go there, we forget, and we put that mask on, we fail to take it off. So on that note, like I said, thank you for throwing out some heavy light. This is one of those sessions that we need to have as required watching or listening for students who are going to get into the pedagogy of the press and so on. So as we always end, thank you very much. We hope that you've enjoyed this edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. Join us again for another edition. Barocco. As we always say, may the force be with you.